Chapter 1. After being rejected for a job at the textile factory in the old society, I married Calvin and toiled for him in the countryside for a lifetime. Yet, as I became ill from overwork and lay languishing, he smiled as if relieved. It was wrong of me to let Caro replace your job, but having you bear me so many children, I consider that compensation enough. Hearing this, I was so furious that I wished I could crawl out of my coffin, but my children held me down tightly. Mom, look at you, old and useless, only knowing how to farm. You have none of the elegance and intellect of Aunt Carolina. Just rest easy. Dad has us and Aunt Carolina to take care of him. Looking at the hypocritical faces of these people, I breathed my last with a heart full of regret. Opening my eyes again, seeing Calvin trying to please Carolina with the food sent by my parents, I snatched it back. What do you think you are, to deserve my milk and milk candy? 20-year-old Calvin is handsome, but his words are particularly noisy. Why are you stealing Carolina's milk? You're as strong as an ox. What use is it for you to eat it? Quickly return it. Can't you see Carolina is about to cry and faint? I turned a deaf ear, ignoring the stolen Carolina package I was holding tightly. Open your eyes wide and see clearly whose name is on this. Carolina was shocked, her mouth agape, and Calvin also staggered. The two clearly did not expect that the things I had casually handed over to them would be demanded back. Emma, what are you doing? It's just some food. No need to make a scene. If you want me to give you a little more, just say so. Don't slander me, Carolina said as she quickly tore off a corner of the package and casually tossed it into the firewood stove. The flames quickly burned the paper ball clean. I never expected this person to be so shameless. Old grudges intertwined. I rushed forward and slapped him. In the next second, Calvin shoved me hard and shouted, Emma, you are so greedy and cunning. Are you willing to risk your life just to grab a bite to eat? I stood up abruptly, retorting sharply, stop talking nonsense. This was originally my thing. Carolina's dad is just a small workshop manager. She is in the middle at home, unloved by her father and mother. When she was in junior high, she even wore torn pants. How could her parents possibly send her so many good things? If you have the ability to say this is hers, then show some evidence. Seeing me act so unruly, Carolina hesitated and took a step back. Don't say that randomly. How could my parents have thought someone would steal when they sent me things? You suddenly put me on the spot. How could I possibly provide any evidence? As she spoke, her eyes turned red, and the educated youth immediately echoed her. Carolina has long said that her parents are officials at the Beijing machinery factory, and for 2 years in the countryside, she has been able to receive rare food every month. If it's not hers, whose could it be? Emma, what's going on? You're usually quiet, but today you seem to have lost your mind. I stared intensely at Carolina and Calvin, my hatred almost solidifying into something tangible. This is definitely not from Carolina's family. This is from my parents, who are the deputy factory directors at the machinery plant. Calvin's expression changed in an instant. Shock, confusion, and doubt overlapping. In a past life, Calvin always said that since I went to the countryside, I should hide my identity, work hard on development, and not enjoy special treatment just because of my good family background. On the train to the countryside, Calvin helped me chase away a thief, comforting and encouraging me all the way. From then on, I trusted him immensely, which is why I always claimed that my parents were just ordinary workers. He also said that my parents often sent rare items, fearing that I would be targeted for my wealth in the countryside. Whenever I received mail, it was always him who helped me pick it up. Who would have thought that my trust would be met with such hidden malice today? They took my rare food and shared it with other educated youth and villagers to gain a good reputation, while secretly colluding to rob me of my job opportunities, ultimately binding me to the countryside with marriage and children, causing me to toil my whole life in loneliness and die miserably. It's time for us to settle this account. Calvin noticed something was off with me, grabbed the package that Carolina was protecting, and stuffed it into my arms. All right, Emma. I know you've always been jealous of Carolina's good family background. Just consider these things as yours, okay? I only ask that you stop causing a scene. Chapter 2. I was so furious at his words that my whole body trembled. But I knew that, in my current situation, I was isolated and vulnerable. If I continued to tear at this, it would only be detrimental to myself. Thinking this, I turned my eyes. This is mine to begin with. Stop putting labels on me. Carolina, don't cry here. Just get out quickly. Carolina ran away crying. Calvin hurriedly chased after her, and the dark crowd suddenly dispersed. I threw my things haphazardly onto the bed, lit the kerosene lamp, and quickly wrote a letter home. In my previous life, my family was targeted, and my parents had no choice but to send me to the countryside as an educated youth. After staying in the countryside for 2 years, they contacted the textile factory in the county town, allowing me to take the recruitment exam, and later arranged a reasonable exchange to return to the city using a position from the capital. But that damn Calvin told Carolina about the job recruitment news. We took the exam together, and not only did he let Carolina replace my job, but he also lied to me saying my parents had died in an accident. The educated youth station required the female comrades to take turns cooking, but I couldn't. It was Calvin who, under the mocking gaze of the male comrades, willingly helped me cook. Besides that, he also did many small things for me, so I always regarded him as a guiding light in the countryside, obeying him in everything. The things my parents sent were all handled by him. I never thought he would lie to me. I never expected that he, fearing I would return to the city, would despicably force me to keep having children, binding me to the countryside for a lifetime. With tears in my eyes, I finished writing the family letter, hastily wiped my face, took out a bottle of milk from my package, and knocked on the door of the educated youth Martin. Martin was in the same group sent to the countryside as me. Our relationship is usually lukewarm, but I know he is very tight-lipped. Martin, this is for you. Martin stared blankly at the item in his hand. Big sister, what are you doing? No work, no rewards. I didn't have time to explain everything to him and pushed the item he returned back into his hands. I know you are strong, can hunt, and often go to town to trade wild rabbits for goods. You are familiar with the city, and I want to ask you to help me find the postman. Martin awkwardly scratched his head. Isn't your stuff usually taken care of by Calvin? What's going on today? I desperately tried to control myself, but my voice still choked up. He always takes the things sent from my family and gives them to Carolina, allowing Carolina to use my things as favors. Seeing that I was about to cry, Martin didn't bother to ask for details and readily agreed to help me deliver the letter and retrieve the reply. I know that although he is somewhat rigid, he is fiercely opposed to evil and will definitely follow through on his word. A huge weight was lifted from my heart, and I sighed in relief before falling asleep. Early the next morning, Calvin arrived. I shot him an annoyed glance, but he, on the other hand, naturally sat down beside me. Emma, Aunt Carolina has a child. With a child's temperament, why do you bother with her so much? Besides, she is still my cousin. If we get along well in the future, you will be her true cousin-in-law. Even if you are unwilling in your heart, you can't make things difficult for your own cousin in front of everyone. Can you? What should I say? I scoffed inwardly. Being from a prominent family, I only knew Carolina, who was in my class, and I didn't understand Calvin, who was 2 years older than me. I really thought they were cousins. I was being played around by them. I kicked the door open and shouted loudly outside. Really shameless. Running into my room so early in the morning, saying something about wanting to be good with me. I, Emma, am the biological daughter of the factory director. Why should I associate with a destitute person like you? Shameless thing. Get out of here. I have no relationship with you whatsoever. In the past, I did have some feelings for Calvin and almost obeyed him completely. He thought he could use his good looks to keep me, but he didn't expect that I would directly call everyone over to watch the fun. Stunned for a moment, Calvin gritted his teeth and spoke. Emma, you really are something. If you have the ability, then don't cry and beg to marry me in the future. I snorted coldly and was about to continue cursing, but saw Carolina happily running over. Calvin, I can go back to the county town now. Chapter 3. There was no surprise in Calvin's eyes, but his expression turned exceptionally joyful. Did the textile factory hire you after the exam? That's really great. They were beaming with joy, but my heart sank. How is this possible? Martin agreed to help me keep an eye on the emails. So why were they still intercepted? The letters I send home take at least 4 or 5 days to arrive, and back and forth it will waste at least 10 days. Now I am weak and powerless. By the time my parents' letter arrives, I fear Carolina will have already completed her onboarding, and everything will be settled. I was anxious and blurted out, "Impossible. I am at the top of my class, while Carolina is always at the bottom. How could she get in and I didn't?" Moreover, the job at the textile factory in the county town was arranged by my parents for me. "You have taken my job." Calvin and Carolina were both stunned, exchanging terrified glances. They only knew that they intercepted my letters and stole my job at the textile factory, but they had no idea how I found out about all of this. Calvin was the first to react, clearing his throat and reaching out to pull me. "Don't talk nonsense. That job was arranged by Carolina's parents. What does it have to do with you?" I shook him off and glared back coldly. "Stealing my mail, stealing my work points, and now still thinking of taking my job. If you have the guts, come with me to the team and let the team leader see who is right and who is wrong." The villagers, eager for excitement, immediately responded and crowded around us as we headed towards the team. Carolina looked flustered and at a loss, but as I walked beside the two of them, I saw Calvin comfortingly squeeze her hand. I felt a slight panic in my heart, but I suppressed it and raised my eyes to meet the gaze of the team leader. I reported, "The educated youth Calvin and the educated youth Carolina have deceived me out of my work points, taken my package, and stolen my job at the textile factory." Seeing that I dared to say such things in front of the team leader, the crowd erupted in a commotion, buzzing with discussion. Carolina was so scared that she burrowed behind Calvin, but Calvin was completely unafraid, glaring at me. "Emma, you're talking nonsense. Work points are Carolina earned through hard work. Milk, candy, beef jerky, and milk were all sent from their home. This job," he said, holding Carolina's hand with one hand and raising the letter in her hand high, "was also found by Carolina's parents after exhausting all their efforts for her. All of this is the result of their hard work, and has nothing to do with you, Emma." I know it's pointless to talk to Calvin, such a shameless person. He doesn't influence me at all, and instead, I look towards the team leader. "You know the details of every educated youth's family. I ask you, Carolina's parents are just a small workshop director. How could they possibly arrange a job for Carolina at the textile factory from so far away?" The team leader furrowed his brow, scanning the faces of the three of us. In the end, his gaze surprisingly landed on Calvin's face, and he nodded slightly at him. "Calvin is right. Carolina's job at the textile factory was indeed facilitated by the Wong family. Emma, don't go looking for trouble. Everyone else has left." I was furious, unable to believe that the usually fair team leader would say such a thing knowing our identities. I wanted to argue back, but was drowned out by the villagers' insults. Carolina held Calvin's hand and gave me a smile. "Sorry, jealous Emma, the educated youth. It seems everyone can see the truth. I will report tomorrow. And you, just stay here for the rest of your life." I was so anxious that my eyes turned red, but everyone gathered together, leaving me isolated on the side. Over the years, Carolina has bribed everyone with my things, and now there isn't even one person willing to speak up for me. My brain buzzed, my blood surged, and tears fell uncontrollably. At that moment, a shout suddenly came from outside the crowd. Chapter 4. "What are you all shouting about? Clear the way." With tears in my eyes, I looked up and saw Martin running, drenched in sweat, while not far behind him stood a neatly dressed middle-aged man. As soon as Carolina saw Martin, she immediately raised her voice. "Martin, I got accepted by the textile factory." The man behind Martin pursed his lips and casually glanced at the notice in Carolina's hand. "Are you Emma?" Carolina shook her head in confusion and pointed at me. "She is Emma. Who are you?" "I don't know you." The middle-aged man turned around and nodded slightly at me. "Congratulations. You have been hired by our factory." Calvin's face changed dramatically upon hearing this, and he immediately stood in front of Carolina. "Who do you think you are? How dare you give our Zhang Jiqing spot to someone else? Open your eyes and see clearly. It's written in black and white that the one accepted is Carolina. The onlooking villagers gathered again, pointing at us and continuously speculating. The middle-aged man was completely unfazed as he took the notification letter from Calvin and, with a slight effort, tore it to shreds. Carolina immediately exploded at the sight, desperately trying to pick up the scattered pieces of paper. Calvin was also furious, his face turning pale, and he stepped forward ready to take action. You beast! How dare you do this? Do you know Caro only has this one chance? You will kill her. When Martin saw Calvin getting rough, he immediately stepped in front of the man. Did you ever think about how your collusion to take Emma's spot would ruin her life for good? Calvin stumbled and nearly fell upon hearing this, and Carolina immediately reached out to support him. Don't spread rumors. The team leader has already said that the spot is mine. Watching Carolina's arrogant demeanor, the man behind Calvin stepped forward, locking eyes with the team leader. How would I know that you, the team leader, are in charge of our textile factory's affairs? The team leader looked stunned. Who exactly are you? This is our brigade's business, and it's none of your concern as an outsider. Carolina is inherently stronger than Emma. Don't think that just because you have support, you can take away the opportunity that Carolina worked so hard to secure. The villagers immediately echoed in agreement, nodding their heads. The middle-aged man coldly scanned the room and reached into his Zhongshan suit pocket to pull out a business card. Unfortunately, I am the director of the textile factory. Emma was personally approved by me for hiring. As for Carolina, I haven't heard of her. Suddenly, the surroundings fell silent, only to erupt into astonishing discussions. Did Carolina really steal Emma's spot? With Carolina's privileged background, how could she possibly lose a position at a textile factory to Emma? But the factory director came in person. How could it be fake? Carolina turned pale and nearly fell to the ground, while Calvin quickly caught her in his arms. Caro, don't worry. Maybe there's been some kind of mistake. I couldn't care less about their affectionate display, and I bowed deeply to the factory director. Thank you for coming. Otherwise my spot would really have been taken by Carolina. The factory director looked at me with a reassuring nod and patted my shoulder heavily. Emma, you did well. Remember to send my regards to your parents when you get back. I hastily wiped my tears and nodded repeatedly. At this point, the villagers' gazes towards me had completely changed. Emma said her parents are the deputy directors of the machinery factory. Could it really be true? If that's the case, then Carolina and Calvin must be lying. Carolina wanted to argue, but in front of the factory director, she stammered and couldn't say a word. Calvin nervously pulled me aside and whispered, Emma, your parents are so capable. You will have plenty of opportunities in the future. Why compete with Caro? Let's just consider this as us owing you one. Talk to the factory director and give the position back to Carolina. I promise I will marry you in the future, okay? I pressed my lips together and said nothing, while Calvin was anxiously pacing back and forth. You should agree quickly. The factory director can't wait any longer. Chapter 5. Carolina looked at me with tearful eyes and began to sob. Emma, we've always been helping you. Can't you help me just this once? As long as you give this opportunity to me, I am willing to let you have Calvin. I smiled upon hearing this and looked at everyone. Oh, let it be mine? Aren't you cousins? I've never heard of a cousin who can give up her cousin's marriage. So you were actually planning to marry within the family? Carolina pouted and cried loudly. No, Calvin is just taking care of me more. We are not relatives. Sister Emma, the factory director cares for you so much. As long as you speak up, he will definitely agree. I beg you. Calvin looked full of hope, while the factory director and Martin looked very serious. Under the scrutiny of countless gazes, I raised a smile. Why should I give it to you? Is it because you want to steal my identity, or because you take my things to gain a good reputation for yourself? Carolina, you deserve to rot in the countryside for the rest of your life. You worthless piece of trash that no one loves. Carolina was momentarily stunned, desperately pointing at me with one hand. You stammered for a long time, but couldn't say another word. I shot a glance at the two of them, flicked my braid, and briskly invited the factory director and Martin into my home. As soon as he entered the door, Martin picked up a ceramic cup and poured himself 2 cups of water. "Emma, Calvin bribed the postman with your things. I went to town to get the mail, but the postman insisted he had nothing for you. Fortunately, I was clever and didn't rush back. Instead, I went to the textile factory to inquire, and by chance, I ran into the factory director. You wouldn't believe it. I almost ran myself to death. I was amused by him and quickly took out something to entertain him. Before I could finish my words of gratitude, the door was suddenly kicked open with a bang. Emma, you disregard ethics and engage in inappropriate relationships, using your beauty to seduce the factory director into giving you special treatment. Do you know your crime?" My recently improved mood was crushed by this big hat, and I slammed the table and stood up abruptly. "Stop talking nonsense. The factory director is over 40. How could I possibly?" Before I could finish my words, Calvin burst in with a group of people, surrounding us in the center with an aggressive demeanor. "Aw, you even know he could be your father. Then why did you betray me and do such disgusting things to exchange your body for a future?" I was left speechless by Calvin's words, looking at the man in front of me, panting heavily. I could hardly believe that in my past life, I was trapped in the countryside for a lifetime because of such trash. At this time, especially in the countryside of this era, his words undoubtedly made me feel like I wanted to die. I was trembling with hatred. Carolina poked her head out from behind the crowd with a grin. "Sister Emma, you are clearly inferior to me. How could it be you who got accepted? I understand that you dislike the countryside and want to return to the city, but you absolutely should not have done something like this." I rushed forward wanting to tear their mouths apart, and Carolina immediately screamed and hid back into the crowd. The factory director's face turned completely dark as he slammed the cup forcefully onto the table, his finger trembling as he pointed at the crowd. "You must not listen to hearsay. I have never seen Emma before. Although Emma has family connections, her performance in the textile factory assessment was genuinely the best. By wantonly slandering a female educated youth, you are pushing her into the fire pit." The villager shrugged dismissively. "This Emma is useless at everything. She even needs to hire someone to cook for her. To say she got her position through merit is truly laughable." I was so angry that my voice began to tremble. "I can't handle a big pot of rice. But that's because I'm the most favored at home and have never done any heavy labor since I was a child. Besides, there are so many people monitoring the assessments at the textile factory. How could there possibly be favoritism?" Chapter 6. Calvin gave me a sarcastic smile, gently lowered his head, and leaned into my ear. "Emma, if you want to blame someone, blame yourself for being so clueless. If you had just let Carolina have the position, I could have spoken well of you. But not only did you refuse, you also publicly slandered her, making it impossible for her to save face. So you can't blame us for being ruthless. We can't go back. You can forget about going back for the rest of your life." Without a second thought, I slapped that malicious face twice. "You worthless things. Is this the only despicable means you have to slander others? All right, since you want to tear off the mask, then tell me. I have never left the village except to go to town for exams. What kind of private affair could I possibly have with the factory director?" Carolina looked pitiful, but her words were deadly. "I remember clearly that day of the exam. You were the last one to come back, and the whole village knew. You weren't thinking of causing trouble back then, were you?" Hearing her say that, I suddenly turned my anger into joy. That day I did come back a bit late, but Carolina, it was Calvin who asked me to go to the far east of the town to help you buy snowflake cream. After saying that, I quickly pulled out the snowflake cream and the receipt from the cabinet, slamming them down on the table with a bang. Fortunately, the sister from the supply and marketing cooperative gave me a receipt at that time. Otherwise, I really wouldn't have been able to explain myself. Calvin was momentarily stunned. He had been whispering in my ear for a long time, begging me to help him prepare a surprise for Carolina. In every word, it's all about Carolina liking snowflake cream. I was also blinded by my own desires, and right after the exam, I walked back to prepare for him in advance. I never expected that such a small-time difference would be used by them as an excuse to slander me for having inappropriate relationships with the opposite sex. These two beasts with human faces and animal hearts have such malicious intentions. Looking at the time on the receipt, everyone fell into a strange silence. Calvin clenched his fist in resentment and sighed. Emma, don't get me wrong. I just care too much about you. I like you, and I'm afraid you might secretly like someone else. This is all a misunderstanding. I showed no mercy and fought fiercely. Misunderstanding? You sneak into Carolina's place every midnight. Why didn't you call it a misunderstanding then? Calvin was beaten into submission by me. Carolina quickly came to intervene. My subordinates showed no mercy, and only after venting their anger did they relent. Now, the villagers' gaze towards me has finally changed. Well, Carolina spoke so convincingly that I thought Emma really had gone off the rails. After all this fuss, it turns out that's what happened. Carolina, do you still have any shame? After working so hard to finish the exam, they even went to prepare a gift for you. This jar of snowflake cream is worth 2 months of work points. Not only are you ungrateful, but why are you also throwing dirt on their reputation? And you, Calvin, what are you running to Carolina's room for every night? You all lied, but Emma didn't lie. Even I have caught you. In the past, you said you were cousins, and that was fine, but you have no familial relationship at all. The situation suddenly reversed, and the two were shouted at, being pointed at their noses. Carolina was indignant, crying and pretending to be pitiful, but she forgot that even if she had bribed them with food, in this isolated village of this era, people still looked down on those who engaged in promiscuous relationships. Calvin and Carolina were soon kicked out. I wanted to send off the factory director, but he exchanged a glance with Martin and said it was too late, suggesting we find an empty house in the village to stay for the night. I was afraid of bringing a bad influence to the factory director and tried to persuade him a bit more, but he insisted on staying. I felt grateful and didn't press him further. The villagers felt both guilt and respect for the factory director, and quickly set to work helping him find a place to stay. Little did they know that the place where the factory director was staying caught fire that very night. Chapter 7. The yard was piled high with firewood that everyone couldn't bear to part with. The fire, fueled by the wind, quickly engulfed the entire house. I was awakened by the sounds of everyone trying to put out the fire, and seeing the flames grow fiercer. I immediately wanted to rush inside. Factory director, are you still inside? Say something. How could it possibly catch fire like this? The villagers held me back, advising me that going in was a dead end. But at this moment, my heart felt as if it were being roasted over a fire. He came to save me. How could I just watch him perish in the flames? I was being pulled by a group of people, crying out in despair. Calvin and Carolina looked at my miserable state and burst into laughter. Emma, you really are out of luck. So what if you got accepted? What does it matter to be innocent? Now that the factory director is gone, your evidence of acceptance is also gone. I want to see if you can ever turn your life around. My heart trembled as I looked at the two. There has never been a fire in the village. How could it happen today? And of all places, at the factory director's home? If you say these two are innocent, I absolutely do not believe it. It was you who did it. You were jealous that I could work, so you ruthlessly killed the factory director. You two murderers. I want you to go to hell and pay for your crimes. Both of them wore smiles that were impossible to conceal. This time you have no evidence, so don't even think about slandering me. Emma, aren't you just relying on your family's connections? But so what? If you don't let me go, I'll make sure you never get out for the rest of your life. I was so angry that my vision blurred, and I almost fainted. How can a person be so malicious and shameless to this extent? You are killing people. Calvin smirked with a hint of sarcasm. You have no evidence, so don't make baseless accusations and stop gossiping. Emma, now no one can help you. You can't get out. I was furious, screaming as I charged at the two. At that moment, two voices rang out from the crowd. Calvin, Carolina, you have such cruel methods. This time you miscalculated. It's you who can't get out. Listening to this familiar sound, everyone stopped their actions and turned to look. Outside the crowd, in the firelight, Martin was protecting the factory director. Standing there safely, Carolina let out a startled scream and stumbled to the ground. Calvin immediately reached out to cover her mouth. What the hell? It's a good thing the factory director is still alive. Don't talk nonsense. This has nothing to do with us. Carolina, as if waking from a dream, nodded obediently. Yes, yes, yes. It's truly wonderful that you are okay. Factory director, we are all happy for you. The factory director smiled coldly. Not necessarily. How could you two, the murderers who conspired to kill, be happy because I died and came back to life? His voice contained an underlying anger, frightening the two into retreating repeatedly. Don't talk nonsense. You have no evidence. It's dry and hot. Who knows what you did to cause the fire? The factory director did not argue with them, but instead looked at Martin. Martin slightly raised his hand, and the crowd immediately began to shout, "It's the camera!" Calvin quickly looked up. Then his knees buckled, and he knelt on the ground. Seeing his and Carolina's pale faces, the villagers immediately understood and quickly tied the two of them up tightly. I was so moved that tears streamed down my face. Factory director, thank you. I thought something really happened to you. The factory director smiled without a care. Emma, you're being too formal. It was your grandfather who carried my dad back from the battlefield all those years ago. Without your family, there would be no me today. I was taken aback. I only knew that my parents had a good relationship with him, but I didn't know there was this layer of connection. With the factory director's words, the villagers' gazes completely changed. Emma, I didn't expect your ancestors had been to the battlefield, so that means your family are great heroes. Calvin, Carolina, you repeatedly humiliate the descendants of heroes, and still want to commit arson and violence. You deserve to die 1,000 deaths. As he spoke, a group of people rushed forward, and amidst the flurry of fists and kicks, the two quickly ended up bruised and kneeling in surrender. We were just momentarily blinded by greed. We never intended to kill. I beg you to spare my life. This was all instigated by Carolina. She was jealous of Emma and urged me time and again to sabotage things. Calvin, how can you shift the responsibility onto me? It was you who said Emma was naive and easy to deceive, and that you would only agree to be with me if I used her as a stepping stone. The two of them began to blame each other and ended up fighting. Carolina's nails scratched Calvin's face, and Calvin's fist struck unhesitatingly towards the back of Carolina's head. Watching the grim expressions on their faces, I sighed. In the previous life, you committed numerous wrongs, using all means to deceive and trick, ultimately shamelessly resorting to having children continuously to keep me trapped in the countryside. I thought you two were so loving, but now that the truth is out, how can it be so lively with fighting? Indeed, evil people have their own nemeses. Heaven has eyes, and karma is cyclical. Chapter 8. In the end, it was the team leader who intervened and locked the two of them in the village's ancestral hall to await their fate. I was afraid they would cause more trouble, so as soon as it was light, I followed the factory director to the town. Sitting in the spacious and bright workshop, I couldn't help but feel a moment of daze. It turns out that while I was struggling to make a living in the countryside, they were living such a happy and comfortable life. Having once lost everything, I cherish it all the more. I arrive at work the earliest and return to the dormitory the latest, and soon I was recognized as a model worker, proudly wearing a big red flower on my chest. Not long after, my parents took a long vacation and came to the town in person. Seeing their still dark hair, tears streamed down my face. In the last life, Calvin, fearing that the truth would be exposed, deceived me with a letter saying that my parents had died unexpectedly, and then told my parents that I had died from poisoning after eating something wrong. It's pitiful that our family of 3 didn't even get to see each other for the last time. My heart was in turmoil. After recounting my experiences during this time, my parents slammed the table in anger, their fury reaching a boiling point. I know that Carolina's father's position as the workshop director is likely to be lost this time. Sure enough, it wasn't long before I received the notice that Carolina's father had been demoted. Not only that, even the team leader was found to have accepted bribes and engaged in corruption, and was directly dismissed. Carolina, who was already the least favored at home, was left with no way out and was completely dumbfounded. In order to seek a new path, she actually went ahead and got a marriage certificate with Calvin. Not long after the two got married, Calvin used the excuse of needing to take the college entrance exam to force Carolina to hand over all her valuable belongings to pawn. Now, not only have their reputations been ruined, but they also face everyone's disdain because of the humiliation they inflicted on me. No one is willing to help them with labor just because they are educated youth. Calvin, although he got the book back, he had to work from dawn until dark every day. How could he find time to study? In the first year, Calvin didn't get into college, while I was maneuvered back to the capital city by my family. In the second year, Calvin frantically pressured Carolina to help him regain his share of the work points, and the once charming Carolina aged rapidly due to her relentless labor day and night. But even so, Calvin still couldn't manage to pass the exam on his own. After the policy relaxed, I used my family's connections to help Martin return home, who had once helped me. Until Martin comes back, these two people are still in the countryside rolling up their pants to plant rice. I heard Carolina is pregnant. The first child died in the womb due to exhaustion, but the second one was born. However, Calvin thinks the child is a burden and actually took it to town to exchange for money. As I listened to Martin's account, I couldn't help but get goosebumps. Even a tiger does not eat its cubs. In my previous life, if I hadn't protected my children, they would have likely met a similar fate. But I exhausted myself for my children, and in the end, they just laughed as I departed from this world. There's nothing to reminisce about. After experiencing 2 consecutive shocks, Carolina gradually became a bit unhinged. She sometimes laughed heartily, and at other times cried loudly. I heard she always looked for someone to talk to in the fields, saying that in her past life she got a job at the textile factory and even brought Calvin in. They said the two deceived me, living as wild mandarin ducks for a lifetime. She also said that all the wild rabbits I caught by hand Calvin were taken back to town for her enjoyment. The coat I made from the collected furs made her the envy of all the women in town. She said a lot, but everyone thought it was a madman rambling. I listened so intently that my nails dug into my flesh. It turned out that in places I didn't know, they were living such carefree and happy lives. Only in this life Carolina has been kicked out of her home to marry someone else, while Calvin has no abilities and has become a drunken wife-beater, a useless person who wakes up every day complaining about the world. Our destinies have finally returned to the right path. Not long after, I used the experience I had heard from others in my previous life to head south and trade clothing and tapes, quickly earning a fortune, and then used that money to expand my business in response to the call, soon becoming a well-known entrepreneur in the surrounding areas. The factory needs to expand its workforce, so I personally went to the countryside to recruit. The villagers who used to help Carolina Calvin speak ill of me now look at me with increasing respect, fearing they might not be chosen, and I couldn't care less about those things. I just let them rely on their own abilities. After selecting the people, I crouched down and squeezed into the red flag sedan, just about to close the door when a force suddenly stopped me. Looking up, I saw that the person approaching was covered in dirt, almost unrecognizable as a human. He hunched over and trembled as he spoke to me. "Emma, I am Calvin. I know deep down you can't let go of me. You came back specifically to recruit me, just to take me away, right?" As he spoke, he tried to squeeze into the car, but before his hand could touch me, someone behind him yanked him back hard. "Calvin, you beast. I knew you still had feelings for Emma." Calvin didn't hesitate, slapping the person in the face. "Carolina, you shrew. He is now a big boss. What do you, an illiterate, understand?" Carolina ignored everything, throwing punches and kicks at Calvin, and in no time, she was kicked down by Calvin. I looked on coldly for a while, found it uninteresting, turned my head straight, and stared ahead. "Let's drive. There are already enough people. I will not come back to this place. Yet some people will be completely forgotten on this land.